The city of Hamilton's cool quotient has been on the rise for some time, but the prosperity that's got some celebrating has others worried about whether the urban renaissance there could be leaving some people behind. And after a one-night spree of vandalism on downtown's Locke Street recently, and the community's response to it, well, it suggests there's lots of strong feelings about where things are headed. Joining us now from the ambitious city for more via Skype, Richard Harris. He's a professor of urban geography at McMaster University. And here in our studio, Matthew Green, Hamilton City Councillor for Ward 3 and Treasurer of the city's Public Housing Corporation. Laura Katari, she's coordinator of Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction's campaign. And Krista Boyer, she is realtor and founder of the city branding initiative, Try Hamilton, which we are doing on our program tonight. So good of all of you to join us. Thank you, Richard, for being there from the Steel City as well. And actually, as the words come out of my mouth, Richard, the Steel City, perhaps we should just start there. My hunch is a lot of people's impression of Hamilton is 30 years out of date. And I wonder if you could just very gently and briefly tell us about how the city's story has changed over the last few decades.
Well, for sure, it's lost a lot of manufacturing jobs, including that steel. The main employers these days are health and education. So that's certainly a big change in terms of most people's perception. The one thing that hasn't changed very much, but I guess that's the main topic of the day, is the character of the lower city, which is still very much a relatively low-income sort of area. But if you're talking about the city as a whole, it brands itself these days as the city of waterfalls, which I guess was always true.
Was always true, and now people are actually going to see them in bigger numbers. How about, though, whether you want to call it urban renewal or gentrification, pick your term. How recent a phenomenon is that in the city of Hamilton?
Well, it's certainly the last decade. Really, it's gathered momentum in the last 5 years, really. Certainly people weren't talking about it much before, let's say, 5 years ago. The map that's up on your screens, I guess, let me say three things about that map, or that you need to bear in mind thinking about it. The number one, it's a map of change. That is to say, change in the relative income position of these different parts of the urban area. So the green, yes, that's areas that have seen in that period of time, 2005 to 2015, have seen a rise in income. The orange is a downward shift, but it doesn't say anything about actually the level of income at any point in time. So some of those green areas were high income, some were middle income, some were low income. So this is just an issue of change. The other thing about the map, of course, is that those suburban areas, and they're suburban and exurban and peri-urban, or whatever, rural in parts, it's kind of misleading because in terms of population, the population of many of those areas is relatively limited. So that's the other thing. And then the third thing is, as a map of change, it doesn't say anything about the relative income, the actual income level in those different parts of the urban area. And the story of Hamilton, as you know, Steve, as many people know, in recent decades, since the 70s certainly, has been a long-run decline of the lower city below the escarpment, close to the lake. Those are the older parts of the city. By 2005, the average income in that whole area was 75 to 80% that of the metropolitan area. So it was one of the largest areas of low-income settlement or neighborhoods in the whole of the country.
Okay, let me follow up with Laura on this, because I think the first time you were on this program, Laura, you described Hamilton as a reasonable place to live. Is it still?
No, absolutely not. At the time, I actually recall that. I was paying about $525 a month for my shelter. And now it's about double that. And that's only 6 years. So there's been a shocking rise in shelter costs in the city.
How come?
Well, part of it is this wonderful renewal of the core. I live right downtown. And the other part is we are seeing more transplants from Toronto. It's getting totally unaffordable for them. They're coming to where the market was lower. And it's being eaten up. The other problem is vacancy rates. When vacancy rates get very low, what we see is rental rates go really high. It's just supply and demand.
Gotcha. Try Hamilton is your group.
Yes.
What's your mission?
So Try Hamilton was born out of the desire to showcase neighborhoods. And originally, the intent was for it to be a real estate crawl, but I wanted it to be more than that because of my affliction for Hamilton. So as opposed to making...
Sorry, did you say affliction for Hamilton?
Or love for it, sorry, affection.
You mean affection?
Yes,
Yeah, okay.
yes. Thank you, thank you.
I thought we should clarify that off the top there, okay.
But so what I wanted to demonstrate in these neighborhoods, Barton and Kenilworth being the first of which we explored, was that there was also this community base there. So the investment piece that we put together was one that showcased the investment on a financial and emotional and a physical level. So we have a holistic approach when we do our events. The idea is to demonstrate the community that exists and then show people the opportunities as far as where the gaps are and how they can insert themselves within that established community.
Okay. What's your concern on this issue?
Well, I think the concern is that we continue to use this word gentrification, frequently used, very rarely understood. And I think Richard touched on some of the preconditions that started probably in the 80s. So we had NAFTA, the wholesale sell-off of our industrial legacy industries in the North End, which caused, I think, middle-class flight from inner cities, the rush for middle-class families to go to suburbs. Then we had redlining of our neighborhoods.
What does that mean?
It means that mortgage companies and banks refuse to provide capital to local economies to allow local businesses to invest in their own neighborhoods. And then we had what many of us feel is a policy of social containment, where in the very place that Krista was talking about, the Barton-Kenilworth area, there was seemed to be this policy of containment of social pressure, drug trade, sex trade, and then the, I'm going to say artificially suppressed values of housing. Fast forward to now, I believe that the folks that are moving to Toronto are moving because of a system that has priced them out of their own neighborhoods.
So you mean moving from Toronto?
Correct, moving out of Toronto,
to Hamilton.
It's, they are a effect of a cause, and that cause is the commodification of housing. Mm-hmm. So when we allow markets to determine where people live and what is affordable, we are going to have this ecosystem that shifts people to other cities because they are increasingly caught with higher costs of living, and they have to move to Hamilton.
Let me throw the other side of the argument out there, though, for argument's sake, which is, I mean, the neighborhood that you have described, the Barton-Kenilworth area, that's the sort of the older east end of the city, some of which is fairly run down, some of which has been abandoned. If people want to come in and, okay, this word is very pejorative again, but let's try it, and gentrify or renew or bring back to life buildings which had been empty or left derelict, therefore are providing no revenue to the city, what's wrong with that?
Well, you raise a great point. There is a process of what I call vulture capitalism, where people will come into communities and they will speculate and they will continue to leave buildings empty, unused. And quite frankly, the municipalities participate in this process because the only way that we can draw revenues into municipalities is for what we call economic uplift. And that is the forced appreciation of prices to allow for MPAC to then put a higher tax assessment to allow more revenues to the municipalities. The challenge that we have is that some of these businesses that are coming into our communities, they don't necessarily serve our communities. And for some folks, it might be distasteful that there's a restaurant that opens up where a meal might cost what they budget for a week in food. And so if we're not reflecting fair economies and local economies, if we're not providing access to capital for local communities, then we are participating in a vulture capitalism which preys on these neighborhoods which have been suppressed through social pressure.
Laura, can you tell us how that looks from your end of things? Because again, some people would say, as Matthew calls them, vulture capitalists are in fact not vultures. They are coming in and renewing parts of the city that have long been left dead.
I want to pick up something that Matthew said. It's the commodification of housing in particular. Housing is a human right, but we don't treat it as such. It's an essential basic need. So when you get investors coming in or people speculating, and I'll get to the people actually wanting to come in and live there and be part of communities in a moment, but that speculation drives people out of their homes. It literally displaces people. And in the core, Hamilton Center, for lack of a better geographical area, we have a 30% poverty rate. So when you double, triple pricing on not only shelter, but on food, on clothing, on all the goods and services available to people, more upscale luxury models, then people can't afford to even shop locally. And so you literally are forcing people out of not only their homes, but out of local stores. When that happens and you don't have somewhere else for people to live in your city because vacancy rates are low, you get more homelessness. And it happens if someone goes into hospital and can't afford their rent, a breadwinner in a family loses their job. We do see more and more families displaced.
Let me go to Richard on the issue of, because I think it's been referenced a couple of times here, the influence that Toronto and Torontonians who are leaving the capital city because it's just too damned expensive to live here now, and what influence they're having on this whole situation in Hamilton. Tell us.
Well, I mean, that's obviously very important. I mean, Hamilton's really different from almost any other Canadian city in the sense that what happens here is determined not just by the local immediate employment situation or anything of that sort, but by Toronto. It's not a standalone, Hamilton is not, and for many years has not been a standalone place. And so when we talk about gentrification, if we're going to use the G word, it's, there's gentrification in Hamilton that's happened in particular areas, but there's also a gentrification of Hamilton, which other people have been sort of referring to, which is to say people moving to Hamilton and maybe commuting back to Toronto, or just moving to Hamilton and trying to make a living here. And then there's the investors, the vultures or whatever. But certainly there's been a huge influence from Toronto on Hamilton. Just the house prices, real estate prices have been going in lockstep, one with the other, for 15, 20 years or more. So as prices in Toronto go up, prices in Hamilton go up.
Well, let me ask Krista about that, because as a realtor whose living obviously depends on properties moving,
yes,
and presumably you like people coming to Hamilton and buying homes there. How do you react when you hear this term vulture capitalist used to describe some of what's going on?
Well, everything can be broken down into subsections, right? Because there are those investors that I've worked with where they're socially responsible. But then, of course, there are those individuals that have inserted themselves in the city, and I don't agree with their practices. And there is a very fine line between the two worlds as far as investment. So it's a real challenge to, I find myself in a very great position in the sense that my clients are quite ethical in their practices, but even still we're within certain parameters and boundaries of those ethical practices. And looking at how investors can ethically invest in the city is the challenge that we're facing in Hamilton. And part of the problem is that they don't understand the landscape, the social landscape that we are all quite familiar with because we are living within the city. So I think there's an educational piece that's missing in it. And as far as policy making as well, I know the city, Councillor Green's been part of that, as have others, as far as putting forth efforts to bring policy making into place to make these investors, these vulture capitalists that are coming into the city, accountable.
Well, the landscape changed pretty dramatically a couple of months ago. And Councillor Green, I'm going to ask you to look at the monitor here in the studio and tell us, this happened a couple of months ago on Locke Street. There was a demonstration of sorts, people wandering through the downtown with this sign saying, "We are the ungovernable." What was going on that night?
Well, what I see in that screen is a group of self-indulgent thrill seekers who, it's not lost on me, they picked John Locke as the namesake of their attack.
Because it was on Locke Street in downtown that they walked along.
But I think this needs to be clear that I don't see there being this low or poor uprising in a class war against the rich.
Well, just tell everybody, first of all, for those who missed it, what happened that night?
So a group of people who are claiming to be anarchists were attending a local anarchist event. Many of which I guess have been reported were from out of town, took it upon themselves to march through our cities and vandalize in a very violent way businesses, while people were actually in them, throwing bricks, smashing windows, and generally bullying and harassing and intimidating the patrons on that street.
You got an estimate of how much damage was done that night?
I'm unclear what the total cost was.
6 figures anyway, though, right?
Well, and I think a much greater impact on the community. What we've seen as a result are counter-protests, white supremacists, ultra-nationalists, rallying on patriot walks up and down that street, and targeting our synagogues and our local communities. And so I think the end goal of an anarchist is chaos. And what we allowed ourselves in our city, to some extent, aside from the Lovelock Street Group, which was a great response, which really supported the street there, was chaos. And I think what was missed is that, and I'm sure as Krista will share, is that these types of actions have been happening in our city. We do have, as I say, a opioid epidemic, which is creating vandalism, graffiti, across the city, and particularly in my ward, which we're trying to address. But what we're missing is that the real violence that I get every single day in my office are the phone calls from families who are being evicted, who are having to find shelter. And when I, as a counselor, have to make calls to every single shelter in my city, only to be told that there is no room for a family, that I have to call Burlington or Guelph to find somebody a place to live. And if I could, to go further, Steve, it's also not lost on me that within a kilometer of Locke Street, that summer, there were 25 people living in tents. We have a tale of two cities. There is a prosperity, but it's not a shared prosperity, and it's leaving far too many people behind.
Krista, let me get you to follow up on that in as much as, yeah, Richard, stand by 1 second. I'll get to you right after this. The ungovernable, as they described themselves, claimed that this was an anti-gentrification protest.
Yes.
Was this the first time that you had seen this kind of protesting against gentrification in Hamilton in your experience?
No, actually. So the first encounter I had with this group would be June 25th in 2016. And it was when I hosted the first Try Hamilton event, and we launched at Tim Hortons Field, where we had a short address with Jason Thorne and Mayor Eisenberger as our guests. And once we were leaving the address, we had 40 individuals who had chased away the bus drivers on the 2 HSR buses that we had and vandalized the buses. And they were there with signs demonstrating their distaste for developers, naming us as developer scums, and using some rude language to describe us as well. And what pursued in that day was eventually they assaulted one of my guests, and then when 2 of the arriving officers attempted to intervene, the officers were overwhelmed, and one of they had their partner, or the person that they were attempting to arrest, fled. Everyone scattered, and the cops were missing a hat.
So this is a phenomenon now.
And it's been ongoing. So since that event, it has been ongoing. So they have actually been directly targeting myself. And they've been doing this through social media. They've been doing this through different blogs and articles and posters, which they're very good at putting up posters throughout the city. They've named me, they've named my brokerage. And additionally, on the 1-year anniversary of our first event, they vandalized my office space and they vandalized the building for which I had prior listed.
Can you do anything about this?
Well, and that's part of the problem. I've had several conversations with individuals as far as, what do we do? And there's those who are in the camp of, we need to have a dialogue with them. Whereas I don't believe a dialogue with this group will get us any type of outcome.
Because they're just plain anarchists trying to create chaos.
Exactly. Like, I see them more as criminals and vandals than any type of group looking for a productive resolution or outcome.
Let me get Richard Harris to follow up on that, if you would.
Right. And actually, I was very interested because I knew some of that and not all. The thing that strikes me about this, the recent events on Locke Street, is how symptomatic they are of what's been happening elsewhere as well. 40 years ago, 20 years ago, in cities that were experiencing gentrification, and Hamilton was not, but Toronto was, and London and San Francisco, and these places were, you didn't get militant vandals, maybe an occasional bit of graffiti or something of that sort, and some concerns expressed. But the vandalism, the militancy that we've seen in Hamilton, yes, but also in Brooklyn, New York, or in Denver, Colorado, and all over the place, I think is very much a symptom of the times. It's not just gentrification that's the issue. People are talking about income inequality, the 1%. The militancy is related to the broader, I think, polarization of politics. Maybe less in Canada than in the United States and other places, but it's here too. And so I think that the kind of thing that Krista's been experiencing, the sort of stuff that's been happening on Locke Street, that groundswell of really militant opposition, it says a lot about the times that we're living in. It's not just Hamilton. It's not just gentrification. There's a much larger context that's really shaping the way that people are acting and thinking.
Laura, let me go to you with this. The group that was involved in this has a website called anarchistnews.org. And a couple of months ago, they put this up, this explanation. I'll get you to comment on this. Gentrification, as an example, when rents go up, it means they make more money rather than lose their home. When prices go up and rich people move in, it means a chance to sell luxury goods while we work for minimum wage. When more police and surveillance come in, it secures your investment while we get harassed and pushed out. They are getting rich because our lives are getting worse. Now, that's their view on this thing. How much following do you think that view has in Hamilton?
I'd like to separate it out. I mean, it's one thing for a violent response, but I think there are a lot of people out there that would not disagree with what was stated.
But are not prepared to crash windows over it.
Yes, they're not throwing bricks and stones. But it is happening. The wealth is not being distributed evenly, even remotely equitable at the moment. And this is what happens. We get, I think, a pendulum swing. You know, we have free market going ahead. We have people making tons of money. And it's all relative. I think that's the problem here. There are people that their wages have increased and they're now over 100K that still say, you know, life is hard for me. I don't make tons of money. Not understanding that the low income measure is $22,000 after taxes for a single person. So you're making 5 times the amount someone else is, and they live in the same community as you and can't afford what you take for granted. And I think it's important, not because there was this violence, but it's important to have the conversation moving forward and talk about policies to alleviate housing crisis, to alleviate food deserts. We're still talking food deserts in Hamilton. So,
and there's a slide that you put up earlier that talked about the growing income inequality. What we need to do is couple that with the rise in the cost of living. And so what we haven't talked about is the real estate boom that was our competitive advantage has now become very much this tool that is causing these families and people to be displaced. And if you look at, particularly at the lowest spectrum on the continuum, folks who are on fixed incomes, ODSP, Ontario Works, and even with this new with the new guaranteed income, it's still below the low income cutoff. So as the market, and this is where I think we can't have a conversation with gentrification without talking about housing, as we allow this market to determine what is affordable and what is not affordable, we are leaving so many people behind. And it's only been within the last year or two where we've had a conversation around suppressed wages. So the idea of raising the minimum wage. And you know, at the end of the day, if people don't know where they're going to go to sleep at night, if they don't know if they're going to be able to feed their kids, how could they begin to have a civilized conversation around policy? And why, as Canadians, are we always defaulting that this liberalized notion of commodifying our very survival and existence is the default economy of a democracy? It doesn't have to be. So as was pointed out, I think very few people would disagree with what they're saying. What they did, as I said, was self-indulgent, and it unleashed an amount of fear and reactionary violence that after those people left, and I think the biggest irony, so most of the anarchists I know are people who've moved from Toronto, who do have post-secondary degrees, who do have the privilege to understand a critical analysis on economies. The working class poor that I know in my neighborhood they're working 2 or 3 jobs. They're struggling to get by, and they don't have the ability to take on issues like these guys are.
I want to add, and I want to touch on what Councillor Green just said as well about, that most people would not disagree with what they're saying. And I think we need to be careful in that area because I've read quite a bit. I've been watching this group for the last 2 years, so any blog or post that they have put out, I most definitely have read. And in it goes on even further where they start talking about business owners and they start making these assumptions as to the type of wealth that business owners have and how they are using individuals in their labor force in order to become these, glorified, wealthy business owners, which is not the case because Hamilton is made up of small business enterprises. So I want to make sure that when we speak about this, we're not so much saying we agree with them. It's more we understand that they agree with the issue. They understand that there is this underlying issue that us as a community recognize.
And there's a lot of confusion around that. I need to be very clear because there's some folks who say that I was too sympathetic to the cause when I was sympathetic to the outcome. I'm a small business owner. That's how I got my start. I've had my windows smashed. I've had graffiti. I've gone through that all. But I think what I agreed with was the statement that you presented. I don't agree with a violent overthrow of chaos, complete and utter chaos. And I say that because what happens in response is that when these people leave and go back to Montreal and Toronto, wherever they go, they leave that violence in our communities. They take off their masks, and as was stated in the reports, they were unable to be found. But I need to also state this, that just last week there was a report of a homeless person who had been ticketed $25,000 in loitering and different. So we have criminalized poverty. Poor people are over-policed and underserved, and that statement remains true. But by no means is there any space for us to engage in sympathizing with the destruction. But it also needs to be noted that on that very weekend, Steve, we had 2 women randomly attacked and stabbed in the head, and a 3rd person shot in the throat. And nobody spoke about that violence, the individual violence that happens to low-income people living in poverty every single weekend. There was no rallies around these families.
So why did this one get so much attention?
Because of where it was.
Well, and I think in the style in which they did it as well, right? It was a blitz-style attack. Sure. They had so much damage in such a short amount of time, and the fact that it was mob-style in its application, so of course that's going to draw a considerable amount of attention.
Well, I don't know. Someone randomly going around stabbing women in the head, I think, is pretty headline-making. And yet there weren't any rallies, any vigils, anything for that neighborhood where women still had to walk alone.
Right.
And the person hadn't been apprehended. So yes, there were fear in both instances, but the overwhelming support was for Locke Street. And I really don't care about the anarchist response to that, but I do care about people in poverty in the city that watched it happen and said, I'm glad you really care about them, but how about me? And I think it reinforced that.
Let me pick up on something Matthew said a few moments ago, which was the affordable housing as the sort of central part of a potential solution to so much of this. And to that end, Richard Harris, let me get you to comment on these numbers here. The Ontario government, obviously in its budget last week, had something to say about, well, it has in the past, and then again in the budget, it has had things to say about affordable housing, such as $3 million to establish a cooperative housing development fund, more than $500 million over 5 years for repairs and retrofits to support energy efficiency, investment of $1 billion a year in affordable housing. Hamilton has its own 10-year poverty plan as well, which talks about $20 million in new affordable rental housing, $20 million to fix units left vacant due to disrepair, $10 million for Indigenous-led investment. As a package of ideas, Richard Harris, how would you characterize these in terms of what they can do to help solve the issues we're talking about here tonight?
It's really difficult to judge because a lot of it is prospective. Certainly what the province has said is what they promised to do, and how that translates, whether that does translate, of course, depends on an election and more than that. There's the federal context as well, the National Housing Strategy, and there's funds that are supposed to be coming from that eventually, which all depends on negotiations between the federal government and the provinces and so on and so forth. Yes, Hamilton certainly has tried to make a real difference as well. The city of Hamilton, I'm talking about. But these numbers sound good, but like any big number, by the time you translate it down to the ground and the number of units that actually are either renovated or created, the impact is comparatively modest. I don't mean to say that I disagree with the initiatives. I'm just saying that it's more than a drop in the bucket, but it's not filling the bucket.
Matthew, what's your view?
I would call it a drop in a bucket that has holes. When you take big numbers like that and you put it down to what it is annually, the greatest shame that we have in this country, nobody living in Canada, nobody should be living in tents. Every Canadian should have dignified, safe, and affordable housing as a human right. And so the fact that our federal government has not in their past budget provided direct funding to the backlog of social housing and built infrastructure in our cities is a shame. The fact that they put billions into a private infrastructure bank speaks to the liberalism of this market. The trickle down has ended. There is no trickle down. And what we realize is that in this conversation, it is a values conversation about economy. And it is about whether we view housing as a home or as a real estate investment. And if we leave it up to markets and private developers and download it to municipalities where really the bulk of the work is coming from municipalities, there is no way we're ever going to begin to address the 6,000 people on the social housing wait list.
Go ahead, Laura.
So I want to add to that. Being on the Income Security Reform Working Group, we advocated for a portable housing benefit, which is great, and the feds have talked about it in their housing strategy. But the reality is there are no units. We needed to start putting shovels in the ground 5 years ago.
Absolutely.
And not only that, I mean, we look just at Hamilton. Food banks have reported 49% of people say they spend, I think it was more than half of their rent, or half of their income on rent. This year, it's 80% of food bank users. So we are not keeping up. It's almost too little, too late, but I don't want to say that to be pessimistic because we want more dollars.
I understand. I got 30 seconds left here. Let me give it to you, Krista, to talk about, there are some people who think Hamilton is kind of trending towards being the next Brooklyn.
Right.
A place that was pretty hard scrabble and is now, quote unquote, the cool place to go.
Right.
Is that a trend you'd like to see continue?
Well, it depends on how that trend unfolds. I mean, I'm a huge proponent of an inclusive type of approach to our community. Despite the fact that I'm a realtor, and I'm sure I'm going to hear it from some of my colleagues on this, I'm not pro big development. I'm a fan of European cities. I'm a fan of the lower skyscrapers and the argument being, maintaining a height lower than the escarpments and maintaining communities and maintaining amenities and maintaining the lower and affordable rents. That's what I would like to see. So if it is a culture that is parallel to Brooklyn, I'd like it to at least maintain that base of a community base where we are, like, conversations like this continue to ensue. And from it, we have productive resolution and outcomes.
Great. I want to thank you all for making the trip down the 401 or QEW, depending on how you got here today. Richard Harris, who actually stayed in the Steel City, professor of School of Geography and Earth Sciences at McMaster University. Richard, thanks for being on the program tonight. Laura Katari from the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction. Councillor Matthew Green from the City of Hamilton. Krista Boyer. Try Hamilton. That is the name of her group. Thanks so much, everybody. Appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.